Hi guys, this is John Adamson, the rehab documentation guru. I got an email from one of the people I attended my courses asking me to do something on skilled service documentation. And when I did earlier courses, I didn't go into a lot of detail about like a formulaic approach to documenting skilled services. So I'm going to give you more of a formulaic approach to documenting. When I say skilled services, what I'm talking about is the definition of what you did with the patient according to the individual CPT code that you did. Now, you guys in home health, you're not doing CPT code billing. You're just talking about your skilled services in the body of your note. And you don't bill CPT codes. You're basically paid for how many visits according to the HERG that the patient is being billed under for their Part A. But if you do home health, you have to be consistent with CPT definitions. If you're saying in the home setting you're doing therapeutic exercise, you got to know what 97110 therapeutic exercise means. You've got to make sure you're sticking to that definition. So here are some things to consider when you document skilled services, what you did with the patient. Number one, make sure you utilize a full sentence for each CPT code or intervention that you do. Listing CPT codes, never a good idea. It does not distinguish between the billing for each one if you do non-home health. And for home health, if you're saying, you had to do gait training, neuromuscular rehab, therapeutic activities, blah, 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 to advance the patient towards these goals, that's not going to be sufficient to distinguish the skills that you are doing. So number one, a full sentence for each intervention that you do. Number two, start those sentences with the name of the CPT code. So if you're doing TheraX, start the sentence with therapeutic exercise, gait training, gait training. Make sure that the auditor, and you got to remember these auditors are not therapists. They're most all the time nurses. They don't know as well as you do to be able to tease through your note to figure out what you're billing and why you're billing it. So tell them, hey, this is neuromuscular rehab that I'm about to tell you about. So be specific. Name the CPT code. That's one thing. Also, when you're documenting what you did as a therapist, make sure it's actions that you did, not what the patient did. While it's important to talk about things that the patient did, we're going to get to that in a little bit. You want to talk about what was your skill that you imparted during that time. And the way to do that is generally start the next part of your sentence with therapist. So let's say you were doing gait training. So you do gait training, and maybe like you use a colon, therapist, and then you use an action word. And those of you that have been in my courses know that we talk about a lot of action words, facilitated. Okay, so let's continue this sentence. Gait training, therapist facilitated. Now, let's look at the definition of gait training. Well, it's generally, it's a fairly non-specific definition, but it talks about basically addressing gait components of gait. Now, what are you looking at when you're looking at gait that somebody that's not a therapist won't pick up on? Well, you might be picking up on foot drop, hip hiking, a lurch, scissoring, things like that. So you're facilitating, let's say, minimization of scissoring during gait. You're facilitating toe clearance and advancement of the right lower extremity. So you're going to talk about the action you're doing and specific to the CPT code. What is it addressing? Well, gait training is addressing these gait components. So we've talked about the naming the CPT, making sure you're the one doing the action, using an action word, and then now we're starting to talk about the target of the action. Every single CPT code has a target. I'll pick on another one, and that's the 97535 ADL retraining code. And that's targeting what are called compensation techniques. Those of you that have been to documentation boot camp know that compensations are things that patients are taught to do to overcome their underlying impairments. So you want to get them to compensate. So the focus of 97535 billing will be compensation techniques that you have trained the patient to do. Things like using one-handed dressing techniques. So you focus on what that compensation was, consistent with the definition of the CPT code. Therapeutic exercise, one that PTs and OTs use all the time. We, we want to focus on a target, and the target would be according to therapeutic exercise, either strengthening, range of motion, flexibility, or endurance. Those are partly your targets. The other target that you target is anatomy or movement or things like that. So be specific. Use that highly educated brain that went back to a place called school back in the day and spent all that money to get filled with all sorts of useful information, and put that on paper. Make sure it's clear that there's a target that you as a therapist with your skill could identify that a non-therapist could not. So be specific about the target. The next thing you want to talk about is return demonstration, or the improvements that the patient is making as a result of what you've done. And so that's called response. So documenting response to the intervention. Now there's two types of response, basically. There's subjective, so what the patient or caregiver is reporting, and there's objective, things that we can measure. And Medicare is pretty clear. Most of your interventions, if you're going to prove necessity, reasonableness and necessity of the intervention, anywhere from 6 to 10 visits is the max you can go before showing efficacy of that treatment, which means you got to ongoingly measure your objective measurements. As if you're billing Therax, you got to show it's making an impact in strength, range of motion, flexibility, or endurance, as long as you have measurements for that. So that's the last thing you'll do on a daily note or a progress report. But from note to note, one of the biggest things you need to demonstrate is the evolution of care. Do yourself a favor, look at some of the notes you're writing right now and look from note to note. Do they look like carbon copies of each other? If they read the same basically from note to note, that's called repetitive care, and that's one of the criteria Medicare uses to not pay for things. So those are the main components of documenting skilled care. And let's see if I can go off the top of my head and spout them off to you again. Number one, name the CPT code. Make sure it's clear to the reviewer that if you're talking about cognitive linguistic retraining, that you're associating it with that 92507 code. Also, make sure you're talking about what the therapist did, because the patient did stuff. That's their response, which we talked about towards the end. But your skill is what you're billing for. So document what you did. Make sure you talk about the target. The target is partly what the definition of the CPT code has, as well as things like anatomical structures that we often work on. And also functions. I forgot to mention that. Targeted functions that we're working on. And then you want to talk about patient's response. How did they respond to your care subjectively, objectively, and evolution over time? Thank you, folks. This is John Adamson, the Rehab Documentation Guru. And if you like this content, please please subscribe if you like it. Also, I have some more comprehensive, obviously, CEU courses are available. One is called Documentation Bootcamp, and that is through Summit Professional Education. And then I have another course, or two courses actually, I teach through Allied Health Education. And one is called Documentation Essentials. That's basically a 2-hour distilled down version of Documentation Bootcamp. And I just have one I taught recently, and it's recorded, called Neuromuscular Re-Ed, which basically takes you from start to finish, how to justify neuromuscular. And then I'm coming up with one, hopefully it will be done this summer. It's called Therapeutic Exercise. I'm a busy guy, so things stay hopping in my life. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye-bye now.